Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North on this Tuesday, April 30th. Hope you are all having an absolutely wonderful day, a wonderful week so far. We will have some real goodies for you. We'll be talking about British Columbia's failed drug decriminalization in just a little bit. Also want to touch on this capital gains tax increase that the federal government is pushing, and a little bit of interesting news that just came down 10 minutes before I went on air. We'll talk about it in 15 minutes when we have Jake Fuss on, but you won't want to, maybe you want to miss that, but I hope you don't want to miss that. But I want to begin talking about crime. Now, I had I've been in a couple of cities in the last few days. I was in Vancouver, I was in Ottawa, and in both cities, I get to the airport, you take an Uber from the airport to where you're going, and both times I landed. I was finding it increasingly the case before then, but it happened again in this last few days, that Uber drivers love to talk about what's happened to their city. And what was interesting is that the Uber driver in Vancouver was telling me that Vancouver's worse than ever now, and the Uber driver in Ottawa said Ottawa is like Vancouver now. And this has happened, actually, the last time I was in Ottawa, something very similar happened, where I was just chatting with the Uber driver, and I don't even like those words, because it's always so fake sounding when a politician says, "Oh, I was talking to a cab driver the other day," but these are true. These are honest, bona fide stories that have happened from my travels as of late. And people are noticing what's happening in their communities. And this is no longer just, it used to be with drug stuff. We'd look at it and say this is a Vancouver issue. But drugs, crime, homelessness, this is now the norm in pretty much every city and many towns across the country. And people have had enough. It's not just a left-right issue. This is an issue that's affecting families, businesses, individuals. And no one is really seeing in federal politics right now, in the government, a leader or cabinet who are taking things seriously. So it's provided a massive opening for Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, who has come out and said, we're going to basically keep keep prisoners behind bars. We're going to keep criminals behind bars. We're going to get rid of this easy bail, this revolving door approach that has people out of jail on Monday and back in jail by the evening Monday because they were just committing crimes with such frequency that the second they're released, they get put back in bars. That's what he's saying is not working for Canadians. It's not working for communities. And just yesterday, for example, there was this horrendous case. The news was announced this morning of a high-speed police chase down the 401 in Ontario, down the wrong lane, as police were chasing a vehicle that had fled a robbery at an LCBO in Bowmanville. And the police are following this car down the wrong way on the 401. And in the end, this car collides with a vehicle that had two grandparents and an infant. All of them, as well as the driver police were pursuing, have died. Now, again, I don't know the details of the person that police were pursuing. I don't know if this was a repeat offender or not. But the whole point is these stories are just coming at a time when we are seeing such frequency to them, that every day crime is taking up more of your newspaper, if you still have a print edition of your newspaper, than it ever has before in our lifetimes. And this is something that a lot of people, I don't think, are comfortable just accepting as business as usual now. And this brings us to, it was a bit of context that brings us to this speech that Pierre Poilievre gave to the Canadian Police Association yesterday. And in it, he laid out his plan, his roadmap for crime. And one of the things that I'll point out here is that he was kind of dancing around and hinting here, but it was very clear what he was saying. And I think it's very important to note that what Pierre Poilievre has been talking about on this is resonating with a lot of Canadians. It is resonating with a lot of Canadians, and it's something that we have one clip. I don't know if we have the right clip. This is, I believe, what he said previously on this, when he's been asked about what he's going to do on crime stuff, when the Supreme Court, if you look back through the Harper years, had always been, or often been, very resistant to this and had been striking down these things as unconstitutional. This is what Poilievre told a reporter previously.
You've talked about the imposition of mandatory minimums for many of these crimes, but mandatory minimums have consistently been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. How would you reconcile that policy with the court's findings in cases like that?
Now, many of our mandatory prison sentences have been upheld by the courts, and all of our proposals are charter-proof. They respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we want laws that respect the rights of all Canadians, including and especially victims of crime. So it's a violation of your charter rights if you get your head smashed in with a baseball bat. It's a violation of your charter rights if somebody throws a firebomb into your child's bedroom in the middle of the night. It's a violation of your charter rights if you open a small business and you pour your life into it and somebody comes along and says, give me $1 million or I'll blow up your family. That's a violation of charter rights. So the 218% increase in extortions under Justin Trudeau has violated the charter rights of all of the victims. And so we know the courts will uphold our proposals today. We'll make sure of it. Thank you. We won't need to because it's all everything I'm proposing is constitutional.
So he was saying there, it sounded like at the end, and I couldn't quite hear the question, that he was being asked perhaps about the notwithstanding clause, which is a part of the Constitution, a part of the Charter that lets provincial or the federal government pass legislation notwithstanding the Charter implications, and it basically shields it from being stricken down by the Supreme Court. But now he is singing slightly a different tune. This was a clip from a speech he gave to the Canadian Police Association, in which he touches on this, and everyone in the room and everyone watching knew exactly what he meant.
All of my proposals are constitutional, and we will make them constitutional using whatever tools the Constitution allows me to use to make them constitutional. I think you know exactly what I mean. So they will happen and they will stay in place, and I will be the democratically elected Prime Minister, democratically accountable to the people, and they can then make the judgments themselves on whether they think my laws are constitutional.
So one thing that I have learned about Pierre Poilievre in the last 8 months or so, actually more than that now, because I started writing a book about him quite a while back, is that he's very deliberate with his words. So when he talks about the people who elected him making judgments, he is saying there, and not that it's all that subtle, I should point out, that he has more regard for what Canadians think of his agenda than what the Supreme Court of Canada might think of his agenda. And that's why he's hinting there, again, not so subtly, at the use of the notwithstanding clause. And more importantly, he's talking about how it's the democratically elected government that ultimately has to be accountable to Canadians, not to unelected judges. That's the point he's making there. Now, the notwithstanding clause, just to give you Civics 101 here, it was put in the Charter basically because there were provinces that weren't comfortable with everything, and it was the bargaining chip that said to provinces, okay, fine, we'll give you this little thing so that we're not superseding your legislative authority as provinces. Now, for most of the Charter's history, for basically 40 years, Quebec was the only province to have used it. And then Ontario used it. Ontario took the hammer, broke the glass case, pressed the button, and now it's been a little bit more normalized in political discourse. And I think the notwithstanding clause has become more relevant in the political discussion as the Supreme Court and as the courts in general have gotten more activist and more antagonistic towards the will of democratically elected governments. And the Supreme Court was incredibly hostile to much of what Stephen Harper did, especially on the crime file, not the least of which was striking down mandatory minimums. So Poilievre is saying we want to bring back mandatory minimums. We want to restrict bail. We don't want that revolving door. And he's saying we'll use any constitutional means necessary, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, if you get my meaning. And then everyone in the room chuckles because they get his meaning. And that's what he's doing. Now, there's going to be a little bit of pearl clutching here. CBC already has the constitutional lawyer being quoted saying, oh, well, we can't just have this normalized and this is going to be terrible and it'll be the disintegration of the Charter and all of that. But as my friend Ginny Roth, who's been on this show before, pointed out on Twitter, anyone who's shocked by this simply hasn't been paying attention. This is not new, she said. Remember, when Poilievre tells you what he's going to do, you should really just listen to him. And she linked there to a statement Poilievre put out during his leadership campaign. So this is back in 2022. And it was a statement, well, he was, again, campaigning for the Conservative leadership, in which he talks about the reduced sentence of the man who killed 6 people in a brutal attack on a mosque in Quebec City back in January of 2017. And he says, I will use the notwithstanding clause to restore the law so that every life taken counts again in a killer's sentence and that the worst murderers stay behind bars for life. And he takes aim at the Supreme Court and says, because of them, multiple murderers will be eligible to have their sentences reduced. So he was very unequivocal there. Yeah, I will use the notwithstanding clause. So obviously now that he is the leader, he equivocates a little bit more on this. I shouldn't say equivocates, but he dampens the language a little bit. But his agenda has been crystal clear on this. And I don't think most Canadians care about the constitutional hand-wringing. I don't think most Canadians care about what the professor of the University of Ivory Tower says about this. I think most Canadians care about results. And when you've got a guy that's saying, listen, all these criminals that are on your streets, do you want them off the streets? Yes, great, that's what I'm going to do. And they probably don't care how it's going to take hold and how he's going to do it. One thing I'll point out, though, that I found quite interesting is that, well, he is doing this, and if you look at the poll numbers, it's clearly resonating with Canadians. The federal government is just completely in denial on this. Justin Trudeau, he gave an interview on a fireside chat at the Canada Building Trade Union, and he basically said that anyone who doesn't support what he's doing must be succumbing to misinformation. Literally, this is what he said.
One of the challenges we have is the level of misinformation, disinformation, nonsense out there on social media means that your members are being convinced not to vote in their own interest, but to lash out in anger. And I will continue to try and have reasonable conversations and not fall into the misinformation, disinformation game. I'm not going to try and fit the solution to all our problems on a bumper sticker or in a 7-second TikTok video. I'm going to continue to have real conversations with people. But you all need to be part of those conversations because your members trust you more than they trust any given politician. And your role in making sure Canadians are thoughtful about the kind of future we're building, the kind of country we're building, is more important than it ever has been. So
it's actually quite brazen that he is saying to Canada's Building Trades Union that, well, you know what, if you guys are the victims here, you're getting all this misinformation, and basically the argument is that if you have misinformation, you'll vote Conservative, but if you have all the information, you'll vote Liberal. That's the point. Now, what's notable is that I was talking about this on the show last week. That very union was the one who was writing a letter to the federal government last week saying, hey, by the way, all of those jobs that you promised us for the Stellantis plant in Windsor, yeah, why are they going to foreign workers? Why are you bringing in foreign workers to do jobs that we want to do ourselves? So that's the union to which he's speaking, that he's now saying, oh yes, but you're all victims of misinformation. So a little bit of hidden context there that you might have missed. And again, I'm sure anyone who criticizes the federal budget is also most certainly falling victim to misinformation, including perhaps those who oppose the capital gains tax. There were hundreds, well over 1,000 people from the business and tech and entrepreneurial space that signed an open letter to the federal government calling out this increase to the capital gains tax. We have a number of experts that are saying this is going to kill off or severely curtail innovation in this country. And now you have a piece that I wanted to highlight from our friend Jake Fuss of the Fraser Institute. Ottawa's capital gains tax hike is the final nail in the business investment coffin. Jake is the director of fiscal studies for the Fraser Institute, and it's always good to have him back on the show. Jake, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me back on.
So this can be very abstract for a lot of people. There are a lot of Canadians, especially as they're doing their personal income tax, that don't know if they have capital gains, that may never have capital gains, and they think, okay, well, this doesn't really affect me. But it does affect everyone if it is stifling business and growth, does it not?
Well, absolutely. I mean, right now we have a business investment crisis in Canada from 2014 to 2022. Our per worker business investment has fallen by almost $4,000, even after we account for inflation. That's not the situation in other countries like the United States, where they're actually increasing their per worker business investment right now. And this is really critical to actually equip workers with the tools and technology that we need to improve productivity and ultimately to actually increase people's wages over time, because when businesses become more profitable and more efficient and more innovative over time, this actually benefits workers and living standards in Canada. But a measure like increasing capital gains taxes is only going to make the situation worse for business investment over the long run.
Yeah, and I was pointing, or I would point out to this one section in your piece here where you talk about how it is reducing the return on investment, encouraging an exodus of capital. And that part is so key because capital is not restricted by geography at this point. I mean, you can make whatever claims you want about globalization, but the reality is we do have a globalized economy. People can put their billions of dollars, their millions of dollars, basically anywhere in the world. And countries do need to be competitive.
Absolutely. And we're not competitive already on many forms of taxation, whether that's business taxes, personal income taxes, capital gains taxes. This is only going to exacerbate the issue now. And capital is very mobile. And one of the most economically damaging sources of taxation is taxes on capital. So people just take their money elsewhere. They're either just not going to invest in Canada at all, or they won't invest as much as they would have in another scenario where taxes were lower on capital. And this is the very capital that we need to actually improve living standards and wages for Canadians. So this is ultimately going to be a detrimental policy towards attracting investment and retaining it in Canada as well.
So is there a way to quantify exactly how much damage this will do, or does that really depend on things we don't really know right now?
I mean, I think it's going to be tough to quantify exactly, how this is going to affect it. But even when we look at already the changes on business investment and productivity in Canada, we've either had stagnant or declining investment and productivity. And that has a big correlation or causation from government policy. So when we're having increased regulations, high taxes, and also massive uncertainty for businesses when you're consistently running deficits, that creates uncertainty for businesses in the future, that they could face future tax increases. I mean, and this is already something that we're seeing now. Capital gains taxes are essentially being used as a revenue generation tool to pay for a lot of the spending that the federal government is currently taking on. So this is one of the many things that is just going to affect businesses and individuals as well, and deter more investment in Canada.
One point here that I think is incredibly important to note is that a lot of the criticism is coming from people that are not in that uber 1% category. I think there's a way to frame this where you think, okay, a capital gains tax increase, this is about the uber wealthy. Family doctors, one example, one group, not an uber wealthy group. Yes, they're upper middle class, sometimes beyond that, but they've structured their businesses in a way where they have corporate capital gains that they rely on. So there are a lot of middle class people that are pretty directly affected by this.
Yes, and I think it's very misleading to just say that, the rich are the only ones that are going to be paying the capital gains taxes. I mean, my colleagues did an analysis a few years ago where they found if you remove kind of these one-time capital gains amounts and just look at people's normal annual incomes, less than half of the capital gains taxes that are paid in Canada are paid by people with $150,000 or more of annual income. So it's very misleading to just say, oh, this is only going to impact the rich. It's going to impact many Canadians that are not just in that wealthy income group as well. And we're already seeing, a lot of people coming out against this policy as well.
I know you alluded to this earlier as well, but we weren't exactly in a great place even before this budget when it came to business investment. I mean, this was already something where we've seen a fair bit of decline. I mean, really going back almost a decade, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, we've been seeing this collapse in business investment really since the end of 2014. We also have a situation now where our GDP per capita it was lower at the end of 2023 than it was at the end of 2014. And then we had, Caroline Rogers from the Bank of Canada raising the alarm about our productivity challenges in Canada. So we have big problems going into the federal budget. And now not only are we not addressing those problems, we're actually making a lot of the problems even worse. In terms of innovation, productivity, economic growth, improving living standards for Canadians, job creation, all of these things that we needed more of, we're now likely going to get less of those due to some of the government policies that are being undertaken currently.
The piece in Business in Vancouver, Ottawa's capital gains tax hike, final nail in the business investment coffin. Thanks so much, Jake. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And one point I'll raise on this, and this just came out just shortly before I went on air, is that the federal government is partitioning the capital gains section of the budget from the budget. So it's not even going to be in, it looks like from the reports I read, in the main budget that MPs vote on and debate and discuss. It's going to be its own thing. And I wondered, some people were saying on Twitter, oh, is this the government backtracking on this? I say, no, quite the contrary. This is the government trying to make it a standalone issue to force the Conservatives to defend the evil, scary, uber wealthy 1%, to defend, I don't know, Galen Weston and Loblaws or something like that. And they do that in a way because they simply do not understand or refuse to accept at least all of the people that are looking at this saying, well, hang on, I want people to invest in this country. This isn't just about eating the rich, as the old saying goes. Now, speaking of the budget, I'm convinced the budget's going to pass. I'm convinced the NDP will eventually roll. But I find it funny that even to this day, Jagmeet Singh cannot say whether he's going to support the Liberal budget. He's clearly going to, but he's not willing to say it. This was a clip, I think, from yesterday of him just equivocating on this, despite having previously told reporters he would unveil his stance on the budget at this media scrum.
Mr. Singh, media were told earlier today that you were going to stand here and tell us your definitive position on whether or not you were going to support the budget. Then we were told you weren't ready to make that decision. What happened today? Why was that switch up so rapid?
There are some outstanding elements that we're still waiting on. There were some commitments made, and I want to be very clear. I'm particularly concerned about the two elements that I raised just earlier, the disability benefit as well as Jordan's principle. On those two, there were some commitments made, but I want some more clarity around those commitments. Again, some progress has been made, but I wanted some more clarity before we make our final decision clear.
What were those commitments? What were those commitments?
Without getting into the negotiations in public, I can say that there was some progress made, there were some positive steps, but there's additional elements that required clarification, and I need to hear that clarification before I can move forward.
Can you say, is it more money? Like, are the feds offering more money for this?
Well, what's clear to me, I can answer that directly. What's clear to me is that the federal government is not signaling an intention to increase the amount, so we're going to keep on fighting on that. Where more progress is being made is around ensuring that the clawback question is being addressed. So we're looking to see more commitments around that. And we're going to continue to fight back, though. We disagree with them strongly on the fact that the amount is so small and they're not seeming to move on that. We'll continue to fight back because we know the people in the disability community have raised this concern. I know the Liberals have heard those same concerns. So we'll continue to fight for a more fair amount. We're seeing some progress on the clawback question.
Oh, yes, I don't want to tell you, we're really, really negotiating hard behind closed doors. We're really getting all of this stuff from them. Yeah, we keep fighting. That's why he doesn't want to say his stance on the budget, because he wants people to think that he's going back there and he's having this big old fight. I forget, there was a movie where someone did that. They go into a room and they're alone in the room and they just start beating themselves up basically and making noises and grunts to sound like there's a fight. And then they periodically pop their head out and be like, I've almost got him. Just, I need a couple more minutes. And then they go back in. And at a certain point, of course, the door opens and it's revealed that they're the only one in the room. Pretty sure that's Jagmeet Singh doing his negotiations with Justin Trudeau. He goes into the room, he grunts, he makes some noises, he screams a little bit, he does his best Trudeau impression. Then he comes out and just, dusts himself off, and he's, put the double-breasted suit back on, and the button fell off, and everything's all askew on his pants, and he pulls the leg down and all of that. And then he just comes out and says, all right, we really wore them down and we've gotten them to agree to, and then he makes up something that they had already agreed to. Phil is asking if I'm talking about Ocean's 11. No, Ocean's 11 did a little similar bit, I guess, where they did like a fake fight in the room, but that wasn't the one. And now just my colleagues are all just talking about movies instead of the show. So I guess I should. Oh, it's a common trope, Sean said. Well, Sean's actually a film guy, so I trust him on that. So all right, next episode we'll have to find like a clip of that, and we'll put that out as like a live shot of Jagmeet Singh negotiating with Justin Trudeau over the budget. But again, he's not saying yet. Maybe he'll vote for it. Maybe he won't. Meanwhile, the Liberals, I shared that clip a few moments ago of Justin Trudeau talking about how misinformation is the only reason that you would basically not vote for him. The interesting dynamic now is that the Liberals are still committing to this whole Alex Jones white supremacy radicalism narrative, which is a difficult narrative to sell when you guys are at 20-something% and the Conservatives are at over 40%. But nevertheless, the government's House Leader, Stephen McKinnon, gave it the old college try in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, last week we saw the Leader of the Opposition once again visit with supporters of white supremacy, anarchy, and misogyny. This has been a regular occurrence. He draws the admiration of people who dismiss the slaughter of children in schools. The Leader of the Opposition now has 30 seconds to speak to this House and to Canadians once I sit down. I ask him to clearly disavow the views of these dangerous people. Will he do that?
That is an
Order.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I unequivocally disavow the guy who spent the first half of his adult life as a practicing racist, dressing up in blackface, accepted the support of Hamas, and now he's brought on the extremist and radical position of allowing legal drug use in playgrounds, in hospitals, in coffee shops that has led to the mass death of our people. Will he not refuse the demand of Toronto to replicate the decriminalization nightmare?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sad to say the Leader of the Conservatives, the Opposition, has shown us his true colors.
He has.
He speaks without conviction and clarity on a question that should be very, very, very simple for him to address. His silence speaks volumes. This is not leadership, Mr. Speaker. This is political cowardice.
So Poilievre has just gotten so comfortable doing the old blackface throwback anytime he gets these questions from the Liberals, and they still keep doing it, so I guess they think it's working for them. But again, look at the polling numbers, read the room, and then we can go back to that admonition Trudeau gave his caucus members the other day of, no, we're not going to go up in the polls this year. Next year, I've got a plan. Next year, it's going to work. So, and if you believe that, again, you got that old oceanfront property in Saskatchewan I've been raving about for quite some time. All right, well, let's talk about British Columbia. I was in Vancouver for a very brief period of time last week and actually got the chance to see my next guest speaking. He's been following this issue in a way that very few in the media are, and I would say having a little bit of success. Now, British Columbia did a significant about-face last week on this 3-year decriminalization project they have in their province, where for 3 years you cannot be criminally charged for using drugs in most public spaces. We're 1 year into the 3 years, and BC has had enough and said, no, please, we don't want to do this anymore. They've now asked the federal government to essentially reverse this project, and the federal government is not yet committing to it. This is a clip from Yara Sachs, who is the federal addictions and mental health minister, talking about how, well, this isn't even really a criminal issue.
I'd like to know what your reaction is to BC pulling back on decriminalization.
Well, at this point in time, I met with Minister Whiteside in BC on Friday, and we are reviewing the request to the exemption that they put forward to us. We're sitting with Health Canada officials at this time, but we are wholeheartedly committed to continue to work with BC. They requested this exemption from the federal government with a full plan for a suite of tools to address the illicit toxic drug supply and the overdose crisis. Our commitment is to keep this firmly in the frame that this is a health care crisis and it is not a criminalization issue.
How quickly do you think you can act? So BC has asked you to take these actions, and as you said, you met with the minister. How quickly can you respond and give them what they're looking for?
Well, considering I only received the letter on Friday and today is Monday, it is under review with officials at this time.
Are you committed to decriminalization? If another jurisdiction, I know Toronto, for example, has an application to allow for decriminalization, would the federal government be in the position, given BC's experience, to be granting more exemptions for decriminalization?
So I think we need to go back to first principles of policy here. In addressing the illicit toxic drug supply and the overdose crisis, we know as a federal government that we work with jurisdictions on a case-by-case basis, making sure we have a full suite of tools available to help vulnerable populations. That includes prevention, that includes harm reduction, that includes treatment, and that includes a full set of health considerations. At this time, Toronto's request is under review. We look at this case by case. It's not an apples to apples situation, and we continue to partner and work with jurisdictions.
To be clear, you would still, decriminalization is still something you would be prepared to go forward with and grant in a jurisdiction.
The overdose crisis, as I've said before, and I say again, is a health crisis issue. It is not a criminal one.
Not a criminal issue. Well, British Columbia is saying, well, we kind of think it should be a criminal issue again. And BC, this is not some like ravaging right-wing conservative government here. This is the NDP government, which has been one of the most effectively drug-permissive governments in the Western world on this, certainly in Canada. And Minister Yara Sachs is now fine with just slow-walking BC's request to get out of this and still actively considering the request from Toronto. This was another clip from that same scrum that I found interesting when, well, let's just hear it from her words.
What does this tell us about the decriminalization tool, though? I take your point, it's a suite of tools, but this is one of the tools. What's the lesson here about that tool?
We are 1 year into a 3-year pilot, and we continue to work with the BC government to evaluate.
What went wrong in your mind? Because 1 year in, BC's already saying we got to pull back and it's too much. So what went wrong here?
1 year in, we're still evaluating the data and working with BC. Thank you.
Oh, it's just 1 year in. We don't have the data yet. Okay, well, you want to do 2 more years of this, Minister Sachs? Is that really what you think people need? Joining me is Adam Zivo, founder and director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. Adam, I know that there are people whose lives and livelihoods are at stake here, but you must have a bit of I told you so with your work on this, and now even BC really seeing the error of its ways to some extent.
Well, so, I mean, the failure of this experiment in BC was completely predictable. I actually wrote an article for the Washington Examiner predicting everything that we saw. And there's a clear reason for this. There are a variety of different ways that you can decriminalize drugs. And some models of decriminalization are actually fairly sensible and have had positive results in the past. For example, Portugal. But what BC did is decriminalize drugs in the least responsible and laziest way possible. So I'm going to go back to Portugal and explain what they did and how that contrasts starkly with what we saw in Canada. So Portugal, in the lead up to decriminalization in the early 2000s, they spent years investing into their treatment capacity to ensure that anyone who wanted to get better could easily get into rehab. Then, when they decriminalized drugs, they didn't just let people do whatever they wanted like we saw in BC. What they did is they created a parallel justice system where if you were caught openly using drugs or possessing a small amount, you were sent to a non-criminal dissuasion commission composed of a social worker, a lawyer, and a psychologist. And that commission could use punitive measures, including fines, to coerce you into treatment. So what this does is it ensures that there is some level of accountability for people's actions and that there is a mechanism in place to push you into rehab, which is very available. BC did none of that. They didn't invest in treatment. They had no mechanism in place to divert people into recovery. They basically said, well, if you destigmatize drugs, that'll increase treatment uptake. And there's no real evidence behind that hypothesis, which turned out to be spectacularly incorrect.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that they're seeing this so early on, I think, is noteworthy because this was a 3-year trajectory. So they, I guess, assumed that it was going to take them 3 years to be able to see if this was working or not. And now a year in, they're basically tapping out. Now, maybe there is a genuine conversion here, or maybe they're realizing, hey, we've got an election coming up in October, and this isn't working, or maybe a little bit of both. But do you think the election is more of a driver to a recognition of wrong? Because they haven't been showing any real contrition on their approach, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago.
I would say so, because when you look at the BC NDP, they've basically done the bare minimum to roll back decriminalization, safe supply. You kind of have to force them to do it kicking and screaming. For example, decriminalization was immediately disastrous. And last year, throughout the summer of 2023, people expressed a lot of concerns about public disorder. Only when those concerns became impossible to ignore did the provincial government try to amend decriminalization to recriminalize open drug use in public places through provincial law. Then, of course, the Harm Reduction Nurses Association launched a lawsuit against the provincial government and managed to get an injunction which prevented Bill 34, which was the law that recriminalized drugs at the provincial level, from being enforced. And that injunction was granted in January. So at that point, David Eby could have asked the federal government to step in. He could have been proactive, but instead he's like, well, you know what, like, it's in front of the courts now, what can we do? And I think it's notable that he only went to the federal government now when there is polling showing that support is consolidating behind the BC Conservatives, who have a serious shot of displacing the BC NDP in the October election.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could then go to the federal perspective on this and why the federal government is not really being responsive, it seems like, to the same polling. I mean, we heard from Minister Sachs in that clip I played a couple of moments ago, and they're basically not even committing to granting BC's request, and they still have this active request from Toronto to do the same thing.
Well, I'm going to be really blunt here. Oh, sorry about the noise. I'm at an airport.
No, I know. I was going to say, I appreciate you squeezing us in here.
So Yara Sachs, the Minister of Addiction and Mental Health, is incompetent and an ideologue. And this is something, I know a lot of people who know her as well. She doesn't have a strong grasp of the evidence base. She's unwilling to listen. She has a certain idea of what we should do in Canada. And she wants to pursue that goal regardless of what we see on the ground. So I don't think we're going to see any real change as long as she's the federal Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, given her background and given her lack of knowledge on this issue. I mean, for God's sakes, she used to be a yoga teacher, and her only qualifications here is that she had a nonprofit based on addiction and mental health. That's how they try to sell it. And when you go to the website, you see that she was advocating for mindfulness meditation. I'm sorry, we need someone who actually has experience on the job running this file.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly valuable point here. And or at the very least, someone who's listening to the evidence and listening to the experts on this and is not so driven by ideology. Well, it's a bit of a victory, hopefully, for the people of BC who I know have been pushing for this. And we'll see if the federal government ultimately goes along with it. Adam Zivo, National Post, and more crucially on this file, the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. Good to talk to you, Adam, and safe travels wherever you're going.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
All right. Thanks, Adam. And that does it for us for today. That is dedication right there. Calling in from the airport. And I'm actually amazed the Wi-Fi cooperated because, well, it rarely does. But actually, to be honest, unrelated to anything, I was at the airport and I was trying to use Air Canada's Wi-Fi. And there's this little board game. Well, it's not little. It's a big board game I like called Diplomacy, and you can play it online. And when I tried to log on to the Diplomacy website where I was playing, Air Canada said it was inappropriate content, so I couldn't get my moves in time. But anyway, that's my grievance. Of all the grievances with Air Canada, probably one of the more minor ones. But nevertheless, we will talk to you tomorrow, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. This is the Andrew Lawton Show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.